The Notebook on Cities and Culture mailing list fires off regular updates about the show, and you, my friends, can subscribe. Visit colinmarshall.org and click Mailing List in the upper right column for details. Season 3 of Notebook on Cities and Culture is brought to you by Carl Haley and Daniel Murphy. Finishing this book, there's one question that lingered in my mind, and that is, what makes you see Holden Caulfield as a Bing user?
Yes, it was exactly the first thing I thought you were going to ask. Restate the question, which is totally unfair of me to ask the interviewer. But
reading your book, the chapter on Catcher in the Rye, inevitably there's a chapter on Catcher in the Rye. You mentioned there's these longings that Holden Caulfield has to know certain things about ducks and where they go, and you're right, he could just Bing the answer. And to be a Bing user is a statement, I think. Would Holden Caulfield make that statement?
It's funny, I have a feeling I wrote that sentence in an earlier draft of that essay, when I was still operating on the premise that, Holden Caulfield was kind of a knee-jerk contrarian brat. Sure. And then it was later in researching that piece I came to the understanding, which is ultimately the conclusion I draw in that piece, which is that Holden Caulfield, yes, might come across as a contrarian brat, but is really someone who is mired in his own grief and is mourning and is acting the way any teenager, in fact, any of us as adults would probably act in an early to mid stage of grief. And so I don't know. I probably had an idea of Holden Caulfield as a contrarian, and then it matured into what we have now. And Holden Caulfield is a contrarian as a kind of bandaging over of his wounds.
Still, Bing contrarianism, perfect, I think.
In a very that's like, I don't know if you've ever seen those hashtags on Twitter that are hashtag thug life, and they're always used in conjunction with something that is utterly mundane and harmless. Like put on the right sock first this morning, hashtag thug life. Bing is probably pretty close to that. Using Bing as a statement is pretty close to that. But you raise a very good question. If there's any plausible explanation for it's that, it may be that the rhythm of the sentence, maybe the sentence had too many G's in it, and I decided it was better than saying Google.
Sure. Yeah. It is Notebook on Cities and Culture. I'm Colin Marshall, sitting right here outside UCLA. I can see it on the sign. We're right by UCLA, the iconic stone statement, so we know where we are. Technically Westwood, I guess, with Kevin Smokler, author of the new book, Practical Classics, 50 Reasons to Reread 50 Books You Haven't Touched Since High School, one of which is, of course, as I said, inevitably, Catcher in the Rye, but there's 49 more. We'll get to most of them. The names will come up. Why, Kevin, do we study novels in high school?
I think there is a high school mandate of some kind, and I will confess I am no expert on education, history, or policy, but I think there is in mid-century America, there was probably, maybe even earlier than that in the history of public education, there was some sort of mandate that public education was about making better citizens. And these were the things that every citizen needs to know. And I don't object to that notion at all, but it's a notion from a time when there was a much more limited number of things that we all knew as a culture, and so therefore we could guess that people needed to know in order to mature into adulthood. I think it's one of the difficulties education is facing now and has in the last 20 years, which is the world has gotten so much more complicated. Like what goes in the toolbox? Like what goes in the toolbox of a student graduating from high school? And when I have talked to teachers about this project, a lot of them say to me, listen, there is like it or not, there is a great kind of professional peer pressure to feel like the student graduating from your class, or even or not even before they graduate, if they transfer schools, if their family moves or something like that, that they are up to a certain level, and that you are not the teacher that fell down on the job when your student shows up for 10th grade at a high school across town and is suddenly, but is only up to 7th grade at their, reading wise or math wise at the new school. And so there is a great professional and that pressure kind of draws everybody towards a core of study at the center. I think, I don't know. If I had to speculate, I would say really since the early to mid-'90s, with the sort of advent of multiculturalism and political correctness, I'm using air quotes now, where we really started to question, where that core started to splinter and fracture and stuff like that. And I think that was a really good thing. I think we were overdue for an evaluation there. But now we're very much like, I think the notion I try and raise in this book is perfectly okay if, as an educator, you think a kid needs to read The Great Gatsby, but be aware that that kid is going to only get a certain amount from it based on their life experience and where they are in their own personal development, and the fact that they were assigned it and had to write a paper on what was the meaning of Gatsby's house being called West Egg or something like that. I mean, Gatsby is going to leave a sour taste in their mouth because it entered their life as something that was mandated to them and tested upon. And that's what I don't know, maybe I'm only speaking for myself, but that was, I didn't want to get, until I wrote this, it was many, many years after I graduated that I even wanted to be in the same room with the books I read in high school.
How many remnants of Renaissance classical scholarship do you see in the study of novels in high school today? I mean, there was a time when we were coming out of the Dark Ages, and old books have the answers. So they had the answers, so we'd better perform these exegeses on them and find the answers. How much of that? It seems like there's a certain sense that procedure is vestigially in high school English literature study today. Like, well, maybe these aren't old books; they're new books. Maybe they're in our language, not Latin. Maybe we don't need these answers necessarily, but this is probably still a worthwhile exercise. I mean, do you see a family resemblance in those procedures at all? It's something I can't escape when I think about how we study books in high school.
Yeah, I think there was the last remnant of it in our culture here in America was actually kind of an inspiration for practical classics itself. Were these books that were written in the 50s and 60s about, like, these are the important texts to read before you die. And Clifton Fadiman's The Lifetime Reading Plan was the quintessential example of it, and a book I admire a great deal and was an inspiration to me and to practical classics itself. Clifton Fadiman, God rest his soul, would be the first to tell you that book was very much of that, the ending of that, very much of an era that is now dead and buried in this culture.
Cannon's death knell.
Right, which is that there was a quantifiable, definable body of knowledge that everybody needed to read, and it was not only critical to your development as a human being and as a citizen, it was also a fundamental part of social and cultural advancement in this country. It was how you could call yourself an American on the move. It was that, and a Tudor house in the suburbs, and a nice square of grass, and a stack of great books or encyclopedias in the family room. And it was what Clifton Fadiman and Mortimer Adler, his mentor, would be loath to admit is it was explicitly tied to commerce. It was explicitly tied to something you could buy and acquire for a reasonable price.
Sometimes in a whole shelf as a unit.
Exactly.
The great books of the Western world, yes.
Border around it. But I think that notion is dead and buried because what we now know is explicit in that notion, and by the way, it's the exact same notion for people who romanticize the golden age of television news and things like, and newspapers, was that the unification as a culture we all felt around those things masked the fact that the perspective they presented was white, Christian, Northeastern, college-educated, heterosexual, male. It was a very, very parochial and simple idea of what it meant to be an American. And I think we've come a long way since then. But yes, you're absolutely right. Like I think there is the exercise I was involved in writing this book was we may simply not be developed enough, nor there may be time in the infrastructure of high school to say, what is the point of reading Great Gatsby now and forever? As adults, we get the forever back. We can relook at The Age of Innocence or To Kill a Mockingbird or any of those books, and to say, oh yeah, you know what? If something's a classic, it's not just because a cabal of English professors named it so. It's because the book endures, not just because it's a good book, but because it is useful to us as human beings and as a culture at different points in our history and at different points in our lives.
We hear these conversations all the time. I'm sure you've heard the most of anybody I know, which is, I read this book in high school. I didn't like it in high school. Oh, high school ruined it for me, maybe. Middle school maybe ruined it for me. Well, you were given it when you weren't ready for it. Which makes you think, well, why are we getting a bunch of books we're not ready for in high school? Or are we in some sense ready for them? Or do we need to be caught unready by them first and then come back to them? What do you think about that? Are we being in some sense well served by getting these books early, or are as many people getting permanently turned off as getting prepared in some obscure counterintuitive sense?
I don't know the answer to that. It's not. I don't think even the most skilled educators are not going to be able to remove the trauma of being a teenager. Whether that comes from reading Pride and Prejudice or whether that just comes from not being asked to the prom by someone you wanted to be asked to the prom by. I just don't think that's going to happen. I do think, though, that I'm not an educator, so I don't know what that experience is, but I do think as a culture we labor under this fantasy, and I use that word because it really mathematically happens very rarely, that I was 14 and I was lost and wandering in the desert, and someone handed me a copy of I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, and I was found. And I think, and that is a living, breathing justification for education itself. So people love that idea. I think what really happens is someone handed me I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, and I didn't really understand it, and I didn't know why the town was called Stamps, Arkansas. What, do they sell stamps there? It didn't make any sense to me. And why? And Maya Angelou is now 80 years old, and in this book she's 7, and I don't know why it was called The Caged Bird Sings. There are no birds in the book, and there's all this, and then I got to write an essay on it, and it'll show up on a final exam, and then maybe when I'm 25, I give it another look, and I say, wow, Maya Angelou could really turn a phrase and put things together, and wow, this was the start of a really substantial literary endeavor on her part. Say what you want about Maya Angelou, she wrote a great first book and has really kept up at a pretty nice pace for someone who got started in her mid-40s. And I think that's more what happens. Either we reject it outright and never come back to it again, or we maybe reevaluate it again. We maybe look at it with the benefit of time or a different context, and hopefully we give it another chance. The invitation in Practical Classics, I hope, is to say that there is something for you in all of these books. It's waiting, it's inviting you in, and you have time. Which I don't consider myself some sort of radical against the grain sort of person, but I think that might be the most radical thing this book is saying, is that there is in fact time. Even though there's 9,000 unread items in your RSS reader, there is time.
You have in the book what I might call a hymn to your own obnoxiousness as a teenage reader. What do you remember about yourself in those days?
Oh, are you asking what did I remember then, or what do I remember looking back upon it now?
Looking back upon it now, writing this book, you had to dredge up the teenage Kevin Smokler and find that perspective. I mean, what use was that teenage perspective, and what perspective do you have on that self now?
Oh, I think I was an oldest child, and I was from an academic town, from an academic family, and I was always kind of pressed to succeed and believed that being smart really meant a lot and was gave you the keys to the kingdom, and I was aware that I had certain skills. I was aware that I could tell a story and string a sentence together, and I was aware that I could remember things and do well on a test, but they were like octopus arms not connected to a head. I was utterly unaware and ill-equipped to how they all added up and how they could be used in some sort of life direction. If
you didn't have context for your own abilities.
Zero. And they felt totally mismatched. Like I was wearing, Superman's cape and Batman's utility belt, and it was all strapped on a department store mannequin and not really my own body. And it was very I really, really lacked perspective. And I think I grew up. Part of that was growing up in a sheltered environment. Part of that was just youth. I just didn't know, and so I was remarkably unself-aware for how my own behavior would be perceived by others, and what it would amount to in terms of relationships with friendships and with people. And so I think in the introduction where I talk about being an imbecile, I think I don't know the formal definition of imbecile, but I really felt like I was more like, I'm not, but I think I probably resembled some sort of undiagnosed autistic where I was like I clearly sort of was good at some things, but it was just planets looking for a sun, being almost 40 now, if I had to sit down with my teenage self, and it's about a 10% chance he would actually listen to me, I would say, teenage Kevin, being smart is a great thing. Knowing when to be smart and when to listen and feel like there's something that other people have to give is even better. It's like it would be like saying, you know what, Michael Jordan doesn't have to show you what a great free throw shooter he is. You just know. You just know, and if you ask, he might demonstrate. But there's no. That was a notion I came to probably 20 years too late.
It sounds like it's not a completely distinctive kind of despair, because a lot of kids, I would imagine, they get rewarded in school or by their parents for doing a lot of things that seem smart or that are smart in a disconnected way, like you've mentioned, but the reward signals that the world is giving them, it's like you mentioned, your abilities not seeming connected, not seeming unified, but the various rewards you're getting from the world don't point in any direction, do they? Especially not when you're also getting handed works of literature and being told, well, this has something else for you. I know we've told you you're smart in 100 different ways, but now why don't you read The Great Gatsby?
Yeah, I think stumbling around in the dark to figure something out, looking for the light switch, I think that's how it's unglamorous, but that's how most of us learn. We learn more like that when we're younger, but that's really like how, at least me, that's how I approach anything I'm unfamiliar with, because at least that is movement. Stumbling around is doing something. It's better than standing there scratching your head and then giving up. And I do this when I write too. I'm like, again, it took me way too long to learn this, but when I'm stuck on something and I don't understand how a bunch of different thoughts line up and what I'm trying to say, I will actually sit there with the page and I will write, what am I trying to say? I am trying to say that B connects to Q via C, and I don't really know how, but that's what I'm trying to say. And it's a little bit like vamping for time. you're waiting for something to strike you, and sometimes it doesn't, sometimes it doesn't. But but the knowing how to vamp means that the audience, which in this case is the idea or your muse or whatever, is not like uncomfortably clinking its silverware against the glass and deciding to go home early and beat the traffic. It's funny. We're sitting here in Westwood, and I chose to meet you in Westwood because I was, I worked here 2 summers when I was in college, and I lived in student housing right near here, and we're staring at the steeple of the Fox Theater.
Yes.
And
Christie and Rush, you're getting.
Yeah, and it really feels like very much like I remember myself being 19 and looking at that and thinking that I had a head full of stupid movie romance, but feeling like I had really come to give my offering at the temple of cinema. And now I realize that the Westwood as a movie watching destination is largely a creature of the past. It's largely a creature of the pre-Netflix era. And it's
pre-36 of the other theaters in this town.
Exactly. I mean, this is a tough. I drove past the Crest, which hasn't been open in 2 years, and is a beautiful movie theater. And I think when you don't have the context of experience and time and hopefully maturity, you can just look at that and you can rail at the unfairness of it. The same, if you like movie going, the same way you can rail at the unfairness of being of someone. And I really liked to read it as a kid. Someone like giving you a book and telling you to do something with it that you enjoy, aka read, and then like zapping all the fun from it by giving you an in-class essay to write on it. And I, not having any perspective on where my teachers were coming from or what the educational process was, I just thought it was unfair.
Right. The teenage impulse to rail at unfairness seems to come up every 40 or so pages in this book, does it not? Am I overestimating?
No, I don't think you're overestimating. That is the jumping off point for a lot of this, and I would be wrong to say otherwise. But I think what I ultimately wanted to take away myself from the book, and what I want readers to take away from it is there's nothing wrong with those impulses. The redemptive quality of it is, look how far you and I and all of us hopefully have come since then. Like, look, if we are able to, if we're able to read Pride and Prejudice, other than as a great example of, as possibly the head of the family tree of British comedy, which is how I like to look at it. I think you feel a whole lot better than saying, why in the hell do I have to spend a Thursday night reading about people with blue patterned china and lace doily curtains, and I don't understand that experience at all, and why is everybody upset about their goddamn reputation and who they marry, and it's so unfair. It's like, whoever's assigning this obviously doesn't understand my interests as a 15-year-old, and I think there's that instinct is totally normal, and hopefully when you get a little wind at your back, you realize that it's a waste too. It's a complete waste of energy.
It's a question I've never quite resolved about Pride and Prejudice. Is it evidence for the triumph of form over content, or the other way around?
How do you mean?
Well, I think about, reading the chapter in your book, for example. I think about how, yes, there's the China and the obsession with marriageability and the many social codes that these characters seem to be enslaved to, none of which apply in our modern world, or the world we're reading it in. But nevertheless, the books, especially Pride and Prejudice, but the whole Austen canon is I would say, more read than ever, because there are more readers than ever for it. It's remained compelling, despite the anachronisms, despite the fact that so much of the content has never been a part of anybody's life who's reading it, which makes you think Jane Austen must have the form down. It must be something about the construction of these books, that's really drilling into the psyche of the reader. But then I think, well, maybe that's not it, because that sounds like a discredited modernist would say that. Maybe it's the fact that these are human stories about romance, and it's the content of that. It's shove away all the sort of surface. And there's less surface than you think in Jane Austen, I suppose. Shove away the china patterns and the dresses, and you find humans interacting, and that maybe that content triumphed over the form. The question is a bit too complicated the way I've put it, but do you see what I mean?
I totally see what you mean. I mean, my own experience with Jane Austen, and I like Jane Austen's books quite a bit, more than I thought I would, because like as a voluble Midwestern Jew with no poker face at all, like sewn up aristocracy when people don't say what they mean. I just want to grab everybody by the shirt collar and throw them into group therapy together. This is where I'm coming from. But I think the reason I like Jane Austen is Jane Austen always seems to me a step removed from the characters. Jane Austen Jane Austen doesn't love her character ways the way John Woo loves his actors. Jane Austen is not in the business of making those people look good, or even sympathizing with the travails they put themselves in. There is a kind of raised eyebrow dryness to what she does that we now think of as just British as a Union Jack flag, but there is a bemusement at the human condition I find very attractive with her, where the premise seems to be no matter how hard we try and be dignified in matters of love, we are all bumbling fools to some degree, and that's not I don't think that's a slap towards her characters, but it is saying part of the what is lovely and sad about people is that they try desperately not to be themselves, but always end up revealing who they actually are. I think if someone was to do Jane Austen now, I think whoever wrote that book would feel the need to be sort of pals with his or her characters. I think Jane Austen's distance from them makes it, to me, seem more human rather than specific. Now, there are generations, millions of Jane Austen readers who would argue with me, who feel like Elizabeth Bennet is their soul sister, or feel like one of the British newspapers in 2003 voted Mr. Darcy the fictional character that readers would most like to go on a first date with. So obviously, Mr. Darcy is a very real person to lovers of Jane Austen and her work. Not to me. That's probably my own shortcoming. I am not great at saying, oh my God, I really relate to the plight of this 9th century Mongolian empress. It just doesn't happen, for me. But that doesn't, I get my enjoyment elsewhere.
P.J. O'Rourke once said that being funny is not about, humor isn't about being funny. It's not about being funny. It's about putting some emotional distance between you and human behavior and observing the patterns. Does that make Jane Austen the great ancestor of all current comedy I like anyway, but much current comedy, of observational comedy, of especially British comedy, but it seems like you look at it that way, there's not much you can't trace back to her.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, let's be fair with the biographical details. Jane Austen only wrote 6 novels. She died in the middle of the 6th one. I think she died in the middle of writing Northanger Abbey, and she was only 41 years old, and she wasn't famous when she was alive. There was a lot of accidents and twists of fate that happened to get her there. It doesn't diminish her achievement for a moment, but there is, I think like the evolution of man, the earliest ancestors may be from East Africa, but we can trace early ancestors back from other places. I think the same thing with humor. I think there's probably several different tributaries that flowed into a couple of large rivers. The Austrian tributary is a big one, no question about it. But I think you could, even in England, you could find others. Someone mentioned a name to me this morning, Oliver Goldsmith, who is not someone I'm familiar with, but he was more than happy to hold Oliver Goldsmith up as another great tributary of British humor. I can see that.
To move some distance from comedy, I'll ask you this: what exactly is the matter with the Scarlet Letter?
You're referring to the fact that chapter has the chapter on the Scarlet Letter has the headline, "The Scarlet Letter, I didn't like it either." Either being the key word, because I had 4 dozen conversations about the Scarlet Letter going, leading up to writing that chapter, and every one of them was like, and every one of them regarded it as like the time they fell off a roof. It's like never ever again. It's funny, I don't. It is not a problem I have with Nathaniel Hawthorne. I actually like many of his short stories. Rappaccini's Daughter is one of my favorite short stories. Like many of his short stories, I even recall having warmer feelings about The House of Seven Gables than I had about The Scarlet Letter. The Scarlet Letter, to me, feels like a made hotel bed. That it is perfect. It is perfectly formed. It is neat. It is neat. It is well thought out. It is careful, and it is just utterly lacking in warmth and invitation. It is just not interested in you having in it, and its very form says that. Now, the people who I know love the Scarlet Letter say it's about love and longing and the torment of the human heart, and that kind of stuff really speaks to them. And who am I to argue? I mean, I find it. David Foster Wallace, who certainly in portions of his career, was not known as someone who wrote the simplest, cleanest prose, said there's nothing wrong with challenging the reader, but it has to be in the act of seduction. Like you can't be challenging a reader as a way of actually saying go away, because then it's like what are you doing? Like the Scarlet Letter to me feels like it's saying go away. There's nothing for you here, and it just feels starched and preachy and barely narrative. But that's the reason it's in the book. The reason it is one of the 50 is the Scarlet Letter to me is kind of a stand-in for that kind of reading experience, and that's a half-assed endorsement at best. But it is one of the things I learned in doing this is that listen, books are not there to every book is not written to give us a hug. We are meant to be challenged. The act of reading, unless you want to use it for pure escapism, and that's fine, but that to me is like only eating junk food. I mean, like, that's not the pleasure that comes, that's not the range of pleasure that comes from it. The range of pleasure that comes from it sometimes is being challenged and being faced with something that's like, oh God, this is hard, or this isn't my cup of tea, but there's some sort of flickering light at the end of the hallway, and I just have to go on just a little bit more and see what that is. That was my experience reading Lolita, which isn't in this book. I found Lolita an incredibly difficult read, and I had to read it in like 10-page chunks, and then do like running stretches afterwards because it felt so tiring. But after every 10 pages, there was just a little bit more. It was just a little bit more. What's next? What could happen next? How will Nabokov say this next? And that was enough to keep me going. And that's seduction, Nathaniel Hawthorne is about as seductive as the cable guy. The guy that comes by to fix your cable. Whatever low budget porn movies tell us otherwise.
You mentioned David Foster Wallace, somebody I read today, but would have liked to maybe have had assigned to me in high school if it was the right piece. He's in the book. He's not somebody any of us remember reading from high school. Does he show signs of being assigned today? Might he be?
I think you're probably already, I don't know this for sure, but you're probably already going to come across David Foster Wallace in more progressive high schools, and particularly with English teachers who were on the young side. I can totally see that happening. The reason he's in the book is on the one hand, when he first came along, I stayed far, far away because I thought he was essentially a pretentious court jester who did nothing but effectively brag about how beautiful and intricate his prose would and didn't really care about my experience as a reader otherwise. I was completely wrong, and the thing that proved me wrong was the essay, a supposedly fun thing that I'll never do again, which is then there's a chapter on it in this book. That piece is the chapter on the David Foster Wallace essay is there because also in big part because I wanted to make sure that I covered some things that were what the generation after me would be reading in high school. I graduated in 1991, and it seemed very much not the point for this book, Practical Classics, to be Practical Classics for, that a student of the late George Bush senior years would have read. By the way, that's me. It's my book. Me. I mean, that seemed that this book is supposed to be an invitation, not a chance for me to bloviate about my own days in high school English. And so things like including David Foster Wallace and including Separate Peace, which was much more read by my mom's generation in high school than mine. She was the one who recommended I read Separate Peace. Those were there to expand the list beyond immediately what I had experienced back then.
A Separate Peace, it seems like, I don't know if it's true today, but it's been true in the recent past, that A Separate Peace has become one of those books that's fashionably disliked. Yeah. How many books of these, don't feel pressed to give a number, what kind of chunk of these books have been or are fashionably disliked?
Oh, that's a really good question. Let me just see if I can talk my way through this. A Separate Peace is fashionably disliked, I think, because it's about an East Coast prep school. and it is about a sort of fallen American aristocracy, a group that is seen as utterly irrelevant to the 21st century, and therefore their trials and travails as 16-year-old boys is like, oh, it's like, you know, like listening to billionaires cry that the private jet didn't arrive on time, irrelevant.
Where's
to
the
our
Gulf Stream?
Yes, exactly. Where's the Gulf Stream? Irrelevant to our experience, to most of our experience. I think it's fashionable to dislike I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, just because liking Maya Angelou at this point is seen as too easy. It's like seen as recommending sleep for exhaustion. I mean, she's too likable. So there's no challenge in saying, oh yes, read Maya Angelou. It's like saying eat leafy green vegetables. I think it's. Oh, I would say a good 20% of this book, I can picture the kind of person or persons who would dislike them. And I can picture other people sort of nodding in agreement at the fashionability of that statement.
Today we both don't want to focus all our energies on the proverbial dead white males, but we also know that 20 years ago it was ridiculous in hindsight to dismiss all the dead white males in favor of whomever came along, wasn't dead white or male, and really whomever. Right. Where are we now?
Oh God, that's a good question. I don't know. I mean, the sense I get is that we're still trying to. We may have swung a long way in one direction in the early 90s, and I think we've course corrected a little bit, but we're still kind of conflicted because I think we're still. I think we're conflicted because we're asking the wrong question. The question we're asking is, okay, so we want kids to read the best. Who's the best? We're asking it like it's a sports hall of fame, which is totally the wrong question. The question we should be asking is, what is a kid going to learn from this particular set of books I've chosen? And and really the fact that Arthur Miller and many of the literary minds of his day admired Carson McCullers, but thought she was kind of minor in the literary canon and died too soon, and we really didn't get a sense of totally unnecessary to the educational process of a teenager. That sentiment. I think every teenager has something to take from A Heart is a Lonely Hunter, and who really cares if it's a better or worse book than The Age of Innocence or A Light in August. The fact that a book may not be the best, to me, is as valuable a lesson as that it is immovable as a stone temple, and therefore as a 15-year-old, all you feel like you can do is kneel before it. That's certainly how I felt. I'll tell you a quick story, which is referred to in the essay on Shakespeare. I liked to shoot my mouth off in high school English class because I was offended stupidly by the fact that someone was trying to teach me something, and I remembered saying, when we read As You Like It, I remember saying, oh my God, how trite it was that the main character dresses up as a boy in the first 10 pages and then meets the character that she ultimately marries at the end of the play. Somehow all that stuck from that experience was Kevin Smokler said that Shakespeare was trite. And a decade later, I was visiting some of my old teachers at my high school, and I was introduced to a new teacher who I hadn't met. Oh, you're Kevin Smokler. Shakespeare's still trite? That story just lingered on and on. And I don't think it was because I was taught by a bunch of haughty people who hated teenagers. I think it was because I think what it reflected was I think my experience was more than just me. I think my experience reflected that there are a lot of these things you read in high school, if you approach them as unassailable monuments to greatness, it's like, what kid is ever going to feel comfortable turning them over in their hands? So that's a long way of saying, by the way, that's just a long way of saying that greatness is the wrong question. I think once we've passed a certain, floor in the apartment building of greatness, the world, the views kind of open up, and we pretty much can choose, or should choose, anything we want from there.
Your teenage self had something of a reverse point, though, about Shakespeare. You know, you read you see these devices used in the plays. You think, that's trite. I've seen that a million times.
Yeah.
Because you read the plays later.
Yeah.
And then you read things that were derived from them in some sense, even distantly, first, or saw them on TV or in a film. And that's a moment where the context sort of floods in and you realize, oh, this one was first. Okay,
Right.
now I see.
Right.
And Hard as a Lonely Hunter, that's a book that can become iconic in someone's mind, even if they haven't read it. Like, oh, that's an important sounding book that I've heard the name of. Carson McCullers, that's the name of an important author. I'm pretty sure. You read this book, someone who hasn't read The Hard as a Lonely Hunter might say, oh, wait, that's a book that a depressed 23-year-old girl wrote. I'm thinking, you know, geez, I'm 28. That's the average 23-year-old girl who seems depressed, would I read a book by them? Probably not. They're probably not Carson McCullers, but in fact, definitely they're not. But tell me about those moments where the context, you know, writing these essays, researching and reading these books again, the moments where the context sort of all floods in at once and you think, oh, that's what's going on here. I had this. The image in your head gets flooded by that. Does that make any sense in terms of the way that you would think about these books?
Yeah, kind of. You know, I think, you know, there is a school of thought. There is a school of thought that I don't subscribe to, which is, you know, that the text stands alone. And everything you need to know is in the book, and that is all that the author is offering us. And therefore we should take them at their word, essentially. And I just think that's like, it's sort of being ignorant of context and history on purpose. It's like it provides no room for conversation. No conversation that I'm interested in, because it's all premised on the idea that Shakespeare is a genius, which really needs to be said. I mean, we got to go back over that one. And
it's the title of the Harold Bloom book, I think, isn't there? Well, yeah. So
Shakespeare, the elevation of the human, or you know why, or like you know Alain de Botton, whose work I love, you know, wrote a book called How Proust Can Change Your Life, and I'm like, I'm sure that's true, but like, how Proust can change your life to me is like saying how you can you know, walk 5 miles a day and be a healthier person. Right. Well, duh. I mean,
it's still better than why Proust is awesome.
Yeah, exactly. Or you know, or why Proust should change your life. You know, have some scolding directive attached to it.
Why you should like Proust.
Yeah, why you should like Proust. Yeah. And now, like I want to never read Proust. I don't want to never read Proust because you know, that's the teenager in me coming back even for a moment. But I think that's the neatest part about rereading, and that was the neatest part about this endeavor, is that I gave myself a little bit of time to kind of contextualize these books, not only in history, but where the author was in their life, what has been said about them since. I had the benefit of everybody else who had read them and spoken wise about them before, and I think that that's there's just something kind of even stupidly enjoyable about that. I mean, like, you know, whether we say it or not, one of the things everybody likes about Malcolm Gladwell's work is it's all premised on the idea, you thought this was this? It's actually this. It's sort of like an intellectual game of 3-card Monte. And I just get off on that sort of thing. And so when you realize that, like, Mark Twain writes Huckleberry Finn over 8 very hard years in his 40s, and is so fraught by the process. He writes 3 other books to distract himself while he's writing Huckleberry Finn, 2 of which are memoirs about his childhood. The guy's probably going through some kind of midlife crisis, and that's not psychobabble. That's just human. That's sort of where we are at that point in life. And so when he sat down to write Huckleberry Finn, there's a reason that all of the adventures on the one hand make you say, oh my God, I got to get me a best friend in a raft. And on the other hand, also say, well, hell, the world that Jim and Huck were having all these adventures in sure seems filled with murder and blood feuds and human bondage and you know, it seems really kind of scary and unsentimental. And I think, you know, I didn't come to this revelation. Clifton Fadiman did 60 years ago, but he said if Mark Twain was really writing a nostalgic poem to an America of long ago, the America long ago seems to suck. I mean, isn't it really about thank God it's no longer the America of long ago.
Right.
And I was like, and that to me was a wonderful realization, because then I was like, oh, of course that's why one reads Huck Finn as a child, other than the fact that it's the great American novel, which means nothing. One reads it because it really has something to say about, like, how far, about progress and how far we've come and how we've learned a thing or two. I feel like that was a long non-answer to your question.
You mentioned, coming here to Los Angeles 20 years ago, filled with the glory intoxicated by the glory of the film industry. Had you already read The Day of the Locust?
No, I hadn't. I think it was a couple of years later, my parents gave me The Day of the Locust as like a birthday present and said, this is like the greatest novel ever written about Hollywood. Which I think is true for a certain period. I think Michael Tolkien's The Player is really great, and I think like William Goldman's Adventures in the Screen Trade is probably the greatest nonfiction book ever written about Hollywood. But I had not read The Day of the Locust, and I think if I had, I would have just been like, who's Nathaniel West and why is he such a goddamn sourpuss? Has he been here? Has he gone to a free screening on the Warner Brothers lot, which I was able to do being a grunt on the Warner Brothers lot 20 years ago? But I think, no, I had not read Day of the Locust, but I think, reading Day of the Locust now, you realize that, it was, Hollywood was as stuffed with riches as it will ever be when that book came out. I believe that book came out in 1939, which is is an open secret, is considered the most triumphal year in Hollywood history. It really looked like things possibly could not get any better, and the streets were just paved with gold. And maybe that's the painful irony of that book was even though it wasn't a success, Nathaniel West was doing just fine for himself, and he was probably reaping some of the benefits of that time in Hollywood, even though no one in that book is. I still think I think what's neat about it is essentially a book about freaks and outcasts, and it's amazing how often artists, particularly once they reach a position of privilege, think it's the time to do their great work about freaks and outcasts. People they may have once been, may still feel like, but really, economically no longer are. I don't know where Todd Browning was in his directorial career when he made Freaks, but
he wasn't so well off in his career after it. I'll say that.
No, that's true. But Tom Waits was 7 or 8 successful albums into his career when he made Swordfish Trombones and later Rain Dogs and all of these albums about, all of his albums about freaks and outcasts. And Diane Arbus, Diane Arbus may have started with freaks and outcasts, but it made her famous. It made her miserable too, but it made her super famous. And Ouija, who was an inspiration to Diane Arbus, was someone who mostly photographed freaks and outcasts, but considered himself a total man about town. He may have felt like a freak and outcast being Jewish in 20s and 30s New York, but he was. If he did, he sure as hell didn't say so. So I don't know. That's what I thought was super interesting about Day of the Locust was how it feels both like an inside job and an outside the studio gates job at the same time.
The books in Practical Classics, they're populated by many a freak and an outcast, and if they don't seem that way, they're characters that still believe themselves to be freaks and outcasts. Teenagers love those, don't they?
Yeah. Absolutely.
Even non-freak, non-outcast teenagers will underscore that. Even the semi-popular kids still kind of Holden Caulfield might be kind of cool. They inside maybe believe he says something important.
I think so. I think that's totally true. And a lot of I know a lot of people who related to Scout Finch, because Scout Finch sort of had this much more pure relationship with her dad. And didn't do a lot of the things that girls were kind of expected to do, and got along with her brother, and had a boy as a best friend. There's a certain amount of wish fulfillment in who Scout Finch was, even though Scout Finch was far from the most popular kid in the 5th grade, or the 3rd grade, or however old Scout Finch was.
Not very old.
Yeah,
on the bottom line.
Yeah. I think I think most writers are not super popular kids. I think which is why we make such a big deal about them when we find them. There's a piece on here on The Stranger, which is the Bible for freaks and outcasts. There certainly was when I was in high school, and its author was the farthest thing from a freak and an outcast. Albert Camus was a high school jock and handsome as a movie star, and had women dying at his feet, and was best friends with Jean-Paul Sartre, and the two of them would spend hours whiling away the time in cafes while their wives, picked up after them. And Albert Camus, minus the Nazis coming into Paris, had it made, and dying in a car accident in his 40s. But excuse me. I think we certainly gravitate towards freaks and outcasts when we're a teenager. And I hope what I'm saying in this book is that it's perfectly human to still feel that way, but we have context and time and wisdom and a better understanding. And in that better understanding, we're not alone. We realize that, I mean, never mind the culture has essentially said, hey, the freaks and the outcasts, you all won.
Take it. It's yours.
Take it. It's yours. There's almost a little bit like if you were a freak and outcast in high school, it's a little bit like, well, what am I supposed to do now? What am I supposed to be angry about? Our president, is into basketball and into big data. What am I supposed to do with that?
If Practical Classics had come out a bit earlier, we'd probably be talking in San Francisco, where the show was just a few months ago and where you live.
Yeah.
But we're here in Los Angeles. But San Francisco it's a city that once seemed to bill itself, or was billed by its adherents, as the great welcomer of freaks and outcasts, or people who describe themselves that way. Is it still?
Yes and no. It is definitely, the perception of that is definitely true. The perception of San Francisco is was it Oscar Wilde said, if someone goes missing, look for them in San Francisco. It must be a wondrous place to wash up, or something like that. The perception of San Francisco as a place like that is as strong as it's ever been, for better or for worse. And there's a certain amount of melancholy, I say, with that. That San Francisco is dying. I mean, it is simply because there are, for San Francisco, for the fact that it is 7 miles by 7 miles, has just rivers of money flowing through it right now. There is and we could say it is the cold, merciless arm of capitalism at work, and we'd be right. San Francisco of the future, in my opinion, really belongs to Google and not the Grateful Dead, to put it really simplistically.
Need we even bring up the Rebecca Solnit piece about the Google buses descending that was in the New York Review of Books recently?
Sure. And listen, Rebecca Solnit is a treasure of a writer, as someone who I read avidly and lap up. Rebecca Solnit, and I believe she's smart enough to recognize the sort of bias of her point of view, which is that Rebecca Solnit is old enough and has been in San Francisco long enough, more to the point, to remember when San Francisco seemed like a welcoming place to freaks and outcasts. And what she's expressing is a certain amount of sadness that it no longer does. I totally understand that. I don't have the benefit of that point of view because I didn't arrive in San Francisco at that time. I arrived in 2000. The first .com wave was already gone. And so, to me, San Francisco was this place that was kind of trying to shed its adolescent skin and operate as a city on the world stage, a city that the world is now watching. And to me, it is just as selfish to want San Francisco to revert, and it would be a reversion, to revert to being some quaint little commune it was 50 years ago, because that's the personality that best suits me or my interests. Cities are bigger than all of us. That is where their wonder and their majesty lies. And they have their own life path, and sometimes it includes us and sometimes it doesn't. But if we love them, which I do, I don't think we can begrudge them for growing and for seizing opportunity and trying to become bigger and better. We may not like how they do it, but that is not something that is invented anew by the place we live in. It is the trajectory of every single city in the history of the world. And to think that somehow it should be different for us because it suits our interest is just childish.
But in San Francisco, it's different. Isn't that the mantra? Things don't happen that way here. It's San Francisco. Don't worry about it.
It is like, I don't want to live anywhere else. And San Francisco is my home, and my wife and I have determined that, and we are very happy and with that decision, and feel privileged to call it our home. San Francisco's terminal uniqueness, as they call it in AA, will be to its detriment. Will ultimately be to its detriment because you can't. The simple truth is the day-to-day operations of what makes a city go are basically the same across the board, and if you're just if you're focused on how different it all can be, nothing will ever get done, and that is what has landed San Francisco in the broke, underfunded, fault-crumbling infrastructure mess it's in now.
You like me are a resolute writer in coffee shops. You there and me here.
Yeah.
Tell me about the life of the writer in a coffee shop, putting this book together, or even doing the next one in San Francisco.
Yeah. I was incredibly lucky to find a coffee shop that, while not big in terms of square footage, always seems to have a free table for me, and has great coffee and friendly people, and I'm able to use it as my office. Basically, I don't like to work at home. I like to sort of keep home and work separate, and I like to get out of the house. And I have considered in the past like renting an office somewhere, but then to me it would feel like having a second home that I had to do all the stuff related to it, and I would have to decorate and clean and maintain and
they don't serve coffee there.
And they don't serve coffee there. And so if my coffee shop in the Castro district of San Francisco remains hospitable, I will do my next book and my next book and my next book there. And sometimes there are times when I can't park my car, or the bus is late, or everybody's sitting at the tables near the outlets and I can't charge my laptop, and I feel angry on those days that I feel some injustice has been committed. But there's no perfect arrangement. That's just the one that happens to work well for me. And it is a specific kind of arrangement, as anyone who is a regular in any food establishment will tell you. It's like you like the people there. They're not your best friends. You do like the people, but it is their business and it is their living, and you are there at their behest to some degree. And so I make very sure to, even if I've got to sit there and be a non-paying customer for a few hours while I'm writing, I make very sure to tip well, to always say thank you. I bring them Christmas presents in December, because I just, I've been given a rare privilege of having some place that's hospitable and warm and friendly where I can be productive on my work, and I want to continually express my gratitude for that.
You put in long hours there writing practical classics.
Yeah, I did.
Stemming from your experiences and the experiences of others reading literature in high school. I don't know how much you want to say about it, but you have an idea coming together of based upon the music you encountered as an adolescent, no?
We self-identify more with music than anything. There are people who really call themselves readers, and there are people who really call themselves film goers. But just in terms of demographic percentages, we self-identify with what we listen to much more than what we read or watch or attend or anything like that. And so I think what I wanted to accomplish doing practical classics was, A, could I write a book that was entirely my own? And B, could I revisit something I found uncomfortable from when I was an adolescent, and reframe it in a way that not only shows that I've grown as a human being, but present it as something beyond my own story. Present it as something, it's not a memoir. Present it as much more a story of, this is an invitation in a very busy, time-strapped age to take a moment and to reflect and to look back on things that have not only maintained their relevance despite you having sour memories of them from long ago, but may still have something for you now. And doesn't that just don't the doors to just untold riches swing open when we allow ourselves that consideration? The music, the line to the music book, what I want to accomplish with the music book is, can I tell my own story and not have it just be about me? Is my own story a window into something larger? And is there a longer narrative arc there? Practical Classics is an essay collection, essentially, of 50 different essays. Is there a longer arc to that story? And was the experience I was having as a young music fan certainly mine, but was it reflective somehow of an experience that was it a single grain of sand example of a larger sort of shift that was happening on the beach? And I don't know the answer to that yet. I suppose I'll find out in writing this thing. But I think the line is that Practical Classics was about two distinct periods of time, and past and present. And the music book will be about two things contained. Will be about Russian dolls. Two things contained within one another.
The universal in the particular. I look forward to it. I've been sitting here in Westwood, Los Angeles, right in front of the UCLA campus, or behind, I'm not sure, with Kevin Smokler, author of Practical Classics, 50 Reasons to Reread 50 Books You Haven't Read Since High School. Kevin, thank you so much.
Oh, Colin, you're welcome. It was really a pleasure to see you again. Thanks.
This has been Notebook on Cities and Culture. I've been Colin Marshall. You can keep up with the cultural creators, internationalists, and observers of the urban scene on the show at colinmarshall.org. Thanks. And special thanks to everybody who backed Season 3 on Kickstarter, including Paige Calvert, Jonathan Crow, Douglas Dollars, Paul Doyle, John French, Eric Graham, Will Graham, Umberto Grant, Kimberly Hahn, Carl Haley, Stefan Halperin, Matt Howie, Andrew Hovenick, Mark Hines, Andy Cooney, Mark Larson, Matthew Lickey, Mr. Munverzi, Rob Motz, Lindsay Muniak, Daniel Murphy, Aidan Millman, Patrick O'Flaherty, Danny Olson, Michael O'Regan, Blake Riley, Rob Schultz, Cam Smith, Small Demons, Todd Shimoda, Kevin Smokler, Thomas Unterberger, Matt Warren, and Wayne Wright.